both conveyed it to millions of people. Like Lincoln, they changed the future of their countries and of the world, and not without a hard struggle. And not without either the employment of some of the dark political arts. But they succeeded, and they succeeded against the odds. Without that clear political direction, however, they would not have won over, and you will not win over, opponents and doubters, for they will sense that you are ultimately indecisive. And if you drift directionless into political conflict, you will find yourself achieving what the opponents and the doubters want to achieve, and you will end up burdened with the knowledge that you helped them to gain that. Now to the present. As the poor old GOP comes to terms with its presidential defeat, it is getting a lot of advice from Democrats and journalistic well-wishers on how it must change to win or survive. These new friends of republicanism are terribly worried that the GOP might disappear entirely unless it changes completely. The gloom of this post-mortem is probably overdone, ladies and gentlemen. Probably overdone for a party that got 47% of the popular vote, won the lower house of Congress, and controls more than half the governorships in the nation. Nor can one help noticing that the advice given this time is curiously similar to the advice given on previous occasions when the GOP lost an election, namely, move to the left and adapt to America's progressive culture. After Goldwater's defeat, after Watergate, after the 2012 defeat, the situations are very different, but the advice is always the same panacea. That makes no sense. To discover what the GOP should now do in order to win future elections, let us look at the nature of the two parties. Both parties have basic strengths and basic weaknesses in relation to the American public. To oversimplify, Democrats are supported for their seeming compassion and disliked for their economic recklessness. Republicans are supported for their prudence and competence and disliked for their seeming lack of compassion and fairness. These images or brands are enduring. To be sure, parties may lose or gain favorable images based on their behavior in office. President George W. Bush lost the Republicans' favorable standing on economic competence. President Clinton improved the standing of his party on the same topic. After intervals, however, voters tend to return to their original views of the party and to interpret evidence in the light of that long-term conception. They operate with a confirmation bias that can be altered only by strategic thinking and committed effort. There's an optimistic side to this. The competence brand on economics should help Republicans to regain their advantage over Democrats on economic policy in the next few years. Much economic news is likely to be bad, and there will be a liberal president and Senate to whom blame is likely to attach. The fact that conservatives and Republicans control the House complicates that somewhat, but still. And if voters decide that responsibility for economic difficulties have got to be shared, even if not equally, then the second factor, namely the gulf between the parties on whether or not they care, will be an election-winning or losing matter. Two sets of figures. Now, here's the pessimism. Two sets of figures from the last election show the importance of GOP weakness here. Of the 21% of voters who regarded caring for people like me as the most important consideration in how they cast their vote, the president won by an astonishing 81 to 18% margin. 81 to 18% on the question of who cares most for people like me. And 8 of the 10 wealthiest counties in America gave majorities to the president. So this was up and down the social scale. What do these figures mean? Well, I think they reflect three factors. First of all, I think they reflect in a way the inherent decency of American voters. This causes many to oppose Republicans out of the belief that they favor the rich and powerful and are indifferent to the needs of the poor and vulnerable. This is false, and we here know it's false, but many people, too many people, believe it. The second factor it reflects is the weakness of the economy and this weakness is not likely to disappear anytime soon. the weakness of the economy makes many voters think of themselves as economically vulnerable, and therefore to support the more caring party out of motives of self-interest. I have to say, I didn't really realize this until after the election, but we stressed our admiration for the entrepreneur too much in that campaign. Yes, it should be there, but not everybody wants to be an entrepreneur or thinks they can be an entrepreneur. Most people would like a good job, which they want to do responsibly in order to support their family. And we didn't emphasize enough the economic security of those voters. And thirdly, the persons most likely to base their votes on caring are among the fastest growing groups of the electorate. So, should we respond, as some argue, by abandoning core principles and adopting a diluted and cost-conscious version of statist liberalism? That, more or less, is what the GOP's critics and some of its own members in the recent party statement are urging us to do, telling us to abandon many policies that are important to large groups of conservative voters in the Republican base. Not everything in what is said there is wrong, but the basic approach, it seems to me, is an essential strategic error. Half-loaf liberalism and a policy of ideological appeasement will at most lead Americans to occasionally call on conservatives to clean up problems created by the excesses of the left. It will actually entrench the policy status quo and make it difficult, if not impossible, for there to be a badly needed debate over American welfare policy. It will never earn Republicans the trust necessary to achieve long-term governance. It won't fundamentally change the image of the two parties. How do I know these things? Well, I've seen this movie before, and I know how it turns out. I saw it in the last 8 years in Britain, since David Cameron became the Conservative leader and embarked upon a policy of detoxifying his party of the same kind of image problems that people criticize now in the Republican Party. This approach combined the avoidance of distinctive conservative policies on major issues like Europe and immigration with a marked appeasement of metropolitan liberal opinion, notably the BBC and the Guardian newspaper, on cultural questions. On its very first test, this approach failed. Cameron's Tories failed to win an unlosable election against a Labour government presiding over an economic collapse. He therefore formed, he had no choice if he was to get into Downing Street, he formed a coalition government with the centre-left Liberal Democrats, devoted to a politics of deficit reduction based on tax hikes today and spending cuts down the road. 3 years after that, down the road. 3 years later, the Cameron model looks distinctly Rube Goldberg. Britain is moving towards a more statist and welfarist policy under a government led by conservatives. Let me give you one recent and glaring example. Recently, the coalition, one in which the Liberal Democrat tail wags the conservative dog most of the time, the coalition announced a new universal old age and social care scheme to be financed by maintaining a low threshold, about $500,000, for the payment of inheritance tax. That means hiking the tax in real terms as inflation and house prices rise. Now, in opposition, the Tories had promised to raise the threshold by a factor of 3 to about $1.5 million. It was almost the only popular item in their manifesto. Only of the parties, only the Labour Party promised to defend the existing level of inheritance tax. And the Tories denounced that rightly as an attack on the middle class. So the coalition's decision to follow the Labour policy now amounts to trebling the tax by comparison with what was in the Tory manifesto. It's a betrayal of the middle class supporters in areas like southeast England where quite modest homes have been pushed by inflation into the high-value mansion category.
GrokTV.